Popular Culture and Social Change in West Asia lecture series. My name is Seoul, as you know. Many of you are in my class, so thanks for coming. I'm an assistant professor of West Asian Studies here in the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations. And I have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Haytham Bahoora. Before I introduce the speaker for today, just a reminder that this is a lecture series. We're going to have a few other lectures as a part of this theme, Popular Culture and Social Change in West Asia. In October, Thursday, October 27th, we have Professor Pelin Baski from Portland University, who will talk about film and television in the remaking of the Turkish nation since 1980. Thursday, November 24th, we have Professor Neval Tahede from Duke University, who will talk about crude extractions, the quest for oil, and the construction of an imaginary modernity in Iranian cinema. And then the last lecture in this series is Thursday, December 8th, Professor Joseph Farag from the University of Minnesota, who talks about gender, nation, and class in modern Palestinian literature. Our speaker today, as I mentioned before, is Professor Haytham Bahoora, who's an assistant professor of Arabic literature and the director of the program in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. His research interests include questions of form and genre in Arabic literature, visual studies, architecture and urban studies, and the relationship between textual and material cultures. He's published several articles on modernist poetry, gender and narrative, and modern Iraqi literature and culture in International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Arab Studies Journal, the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, and the Oxford Handbook of Arabic Novel. He has a forthcoming book which is titled Aesthetics of Arab Modernity, Literature and Urban Form in Colonial Iraq. The title of Professor Bahoura's lecture today is Colonial Primitivism, Folklore, and the Making of a Modern Art Tradition in Iraq. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bahoura.
So, thank you all for coming, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to have this opportunity to be here. I want to especially thank the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations here for welcoming me here. So such hospitality, and in particular to Professor Safari for his generous and gracious invitation. And I'm especially excited to be here because I think it's incredibly important that these networks of exchange happen not just between, say, the United States and Europe, but also for me to learn about what's happening in East Asia as well, and what kind of research or interests students have here, and what kind of work faculty are doing as well. So I'm hopeful that I can maybe invite all of you to Boulder as well, Boulder, Colorado, if you ever have the chance to come, or hopefully I'm in the position to be able to invite people as well. So when I thought of the title of this lecture series, Popular Culture and Social Change in West Asia, I considered how to address the topic through my own work, which focuses largely on the relationship between aesthetics, literary aesthetics, and arts, and politics in early to mid 20th century Iraq. In particular, my research has sought to situate the emergence and formation of new aesthetic forms, and practices such as the short story or the novel, these sort of, or painting, for example. I've tried to situate those new practices within the structures of colonial modernity. So structures and processes such as colonialism and the rise of anti-colonial political movements, such as Arab nationalism or Marxism, for example, state-led modernization programs and their material effects, the expansion of secular education, and the emergence and the expansion of new middle classes in the Middle East and in the Arab world. And in particular, I focus, at least in my book project, on the urban-rural divide. in Iraq, which was both a legal and administrative divide established by the British colonial government. And what I mean by legal divide is that the British, when they colonized Iraq, set up a dual legal system in the country. There was the legal system that was based on what they call tribal law in the countryside, and then there was a legal system in the cities, like Baghdad, which was based largely on European penal codes. So you had this legal administrative divide that I argue became the basis of an aesthetic spatial divide, an aesthetic spatial imaginary that was reproduced culturally in the literary and artistic texts of the colonial period. So you see, for example, in a lot of the literature of the period, particularly written by urban writers from Baghdad, they were writing often about rural spaces, but they constructed this spatial imaginary of what happened in the rural space. And what the rural space signified for them was a whole range of things, and hopefully we'll see I'll talk a little bit about some of that today. So what I've argued in my work is that these structures of colonial modernity were constitutive of the production of new aesthetic forms, and that too often the development of modern Arabic artistic and literary forms has been theorized retrospectively strictly through a framework of national formation and national culture. So the making of the nation becomes a sort of real basis by which these aesthetics are talked about, right? So this becomes the formation of Iraqi art or an Iraqi art tradition. And often that narrative mimics the narrative of the state that the state tells about its own formation, right? The sort of popular narrative becomes entwined with the state's narrative about itself. So what the state says about its immaculate conception tends to be what people narrate about colonial aesthetics too. So on the one hand, as many post-colonial theorists have suggested, the category of the nation is in a large sense inescapable in theorizing colonial aesthetics, because these writers or artists wanted independence from colonial rules. So the nation is a really important category for them. But I also want to argue that it is in many ways overdetermined as a category, often masking the gaps and fissures and dissonances that constitute the making of national culture and the making of the nation itself. And so an example of this in the Iraqi context is Baghdad's Freedom Monument. And there's an image there of the Freedom Monument, which is designed by Jawad Salim, considered by most art historians of the Middle East to be Iraq's most important artist. This was his last work before his death, and the most recognizable piece of public art in Iraq. I'm not going to dwell very much today on the stylistic aspects of the Freedom Monument, but I start with this monument because it symbolizes, in my view, the ability of art to serve as a continued site of popular resistance and social change. Today, the Freedom Monument endures as a site of struggle, popular struggle and protest, perhaps the last remaining public space in Iraq that, in the face of a collapsing public sphere and collapsed state and civil institutions in the country after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, this monument still has the capacity to mobilize all of Iraq's disparate ethnic groups and sectarian groups and different political affiliations to demand social change and social justice. So there were major protests at the Freedom Monument a few years ago demanding anti-corruption, the return of a secular state rather than a sectarian state. Yet the monument's aesthetic qualities have been interpreted fairly formulaic in national terms as providing a visual right to left as an Arabic script narrative of the movement of modern Iraqi history. So if you look at it, you can sort of see this if you choose to read it that way. But that's sort of the way that's been canonized as the correct way to read the monument, as it sort of tells the story of, let me see where I am, the pre-revolutionary anti-colonial struggle to the violent moment of the revolution, which is sort of in the middle, is sort of breaking through, to the post-revolutionary moment of justice, reconciliation, and prosperity at the very end. And at the very end, there's sort of scenes of peasants and workers harmoniously working together. One could sort of do an analysis of each particular relief on the monument. I'm not going to do that today. If anyone's interested, we can talk about the monument later. But I want to say that this interpretive insistence that the monument communicates a forward-moving narrative of popular struggle in the making of the nation masks the often arbitrary, incoherent, and temporally inconsistent ways that the nation is imagined and made. And I hope that in the course of my talk today, I'll show the ways that the formation of Iraq's modern art tradition was constituted through discourses that were mediated through categories of colonial modernity, in particular, the twin categories of civilization and progress that form the basis of what is known as the Arab Nahda. The Nahda in Arabic, I don't know if people are aware of what this was, but it was a wide-ranging intellectual movement of the 1880s to the 1930s, you would say, that had its basis the kind of intellectual and social modernization of the Arabic-speaking world. And Nahda in Arabic means awakening or renaissance. So it was this attempt to very much mimic European progress and civilizational advancement. And that is, my argument here today is that the reach of that movement goes far beyond that particular period and goes into things like the modern art movement in Iraq. So today I'll focus specifically on how and why Iraqi artists selectively mined elements of Iraq's Islamic past to forge a modern figural arts tradition, so figural meaning human forms or animal forms. And to ask why this emphasis on figuration, why the emphasis on representing human form. And so that's one side of it, and then the other side is how the representation of the peasant and the rural space by bourgeois artists or urban artists became critical to the formation of a national popular imaginary. So I want to start with one of, there's another picture of this monument and the protests around it. I want to start with one of Jawad Salim's most recognizable paintings. Painted in 1958, Two Boys Eating Melon, was part of what the art historian Nada Shabut terms Salim's most mature works, the last of his paintings before he, quote, relinquished this mode in favor of sculpture, sculpture being the Freedom Monument. Historians of the development of modern art movements in Baghdad have focused largely on the ways that Iraqi artists successfully fashioned a local or national modern art tradition that blended traditional heritage and modernism. So there's a sort of binary there, the heritage on one side and modernism on the other, and forged a, quote, distinctive Arab style based on a middle ground, end quote, and that's from Shabut's work. As Shabut writes specifically of Salim, quote, he created an Iraqi artistic identity through symbols based on an intellectualization of folk motifs and experimented with harmonizing abstraction in terms of its modern and traditional styles, end quote. The apparently successful blending of local Iraqi vernacular elements, what critics term folklore or folk motifs, with modern artistic movements and styles has led Salim's work to be read in national terms as the work of an Arab artist who managed to cultivate a distinctive yet cosmopolitan and international artistic language rooted in the peculiar conditions of his nation, its history, and its indigenous visual traditions. Indeed, this narrative of Salim's artistic output and his ability to fashion an independent modernist artistic practice through the adoption of abstraction in his art, so you can see that this is abstract, it's not an attempt to portray a real peasant, right? This narrative is largely wedded to reading his biography as a metaphor for the striving colonial nation itself. So as a young man, Salim traveled to Europe, to Paris, Rome, London, where he received his art education and returned to a nation on the cusp of its independence from Great Britain, where he helped with other notable artists to pioneer a modern art movement that heralded the progressive maturity of the nation, able to blend formal European styles, such as Cubism, with the local character, and in Arabic the word is al-Mahalli, of Iraq. So I argue that this approach positions his work as a part of a universal process, a teleological process that is moving forward in the colonial world. The gradual arrival at a distinct, secular, national art tradition that asserts its singularity and independence through a participation in a global tradition of modernism, where every nation and every culture cultivates its own modernist visual tradition. Yet the stubbornness of this heritage modernism binary, which is an ingrained tool or analytical tool of art historical criticism of Middle Eastern art, positions the Middle East as a space of the pre-modern and the folkloric, and as a space of heritage. In Arabic, the word is turath. and Europe as the originary site of a forward-looking modernism that the colonial artist must blend into to partake in global modernist culture. This approach has produced restrictive forms of knowledge and epistemologies on the formation of the colonial art tradition, and it canonizes the figure of the bourgeois artist like Jawad Salim as the genius through which a new tradition is conceived and matures. In the case of Iraq, this figure is Jawad Salim. And my question here is, what if we deconstructed the heritage modernism binary rather than accept it as a natural category of knowledge about art? What might we discover? What I'm interested here is how popular notions such as heritage and folklore were retrieved and mobilized through these discourses of progress and civilization, and were adopted by local artists in the formation of their own modern art traditions. So the Palestinian novelist and critic, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, was a famous novelist. He's a Palestinian novelist, but he was living in Baghdad after the 1948 dispossession of Palestinians from Palestine. He was a major figure of these movements in Baghdad in the 1950s, and he was a chronicler of these movements. So he has books and books of criticism about these movements. And he wrote that by the early 1950s, Jawad Salim's artistic practice coalesced around a series of themes. A move to increasing abstraction, influenced by Picasso and adapted to the use of symbolism or symbolic motifs representing Iraq's landscape and people, and the frequent use of the crescent, which Jabra observes was used by Salim to combine classical Arab, quote, Arab art with, quote, popular themes. In Arabic, this is Mu'alliya Shabiya. Shabiya translates in Arabic as popular. So for artists and critics, the category folklore seems to encompass both the retrieval of the past through the construction of heritage, reconstruction of heritage, and the visual representation of what was understood to be popular, which often included representations of peasants and rural spaces. The critic Sylvia Naif, for example, writing about Salim, echoes this understanding of his work. She writes, quote, he went back to the folkloric patterns that would be found in carpets, tapestries, ceramics, and tattoos. Another Islamic motif was the half moon, or the crescent he used as a basic element through which he structured bodies, heads, and palm trees in his compositions. From the tradition of miniature painting, he took the black ink pen stroke. So these observations are typical, end quote. So these observations are typical of the retrospective analysis of Salim's work. The term folklore is used to describe the retrieval of local Arab or Islamic, and there's often a slippage between describing it. So sometimes it's called Arab, sometimes it's called Islamic, and there's no sort of coherence. Two Boys Eating Melon, this painting illustrates the techniques that are alluded to here. The watermelons and palm trees and palm tree fronds take the shape of crescents. The abstracted, simplified, and geometric forms of the two young boys' bodies reject naturalist representation in favor of the artist's imagination and the imaginative portrayal of an idealized rural scene or rural context. Here, the two boys eating melon clearly evoke a peasant imaginary. The concept of folklore thus seems to bridge the past, the crescents, and the medieval miniatures with the timeless and idealized present signified by the rural space and its peasant inhabitants, whose representation emerges as instrumental to forging an imagery of the countryside. As we will see, this conflation of the past with the peasant, with the contemporary peasant, had its roots in Iraq's first modern artistic movement, which called itself the Société Primitive, or the primitive society. I will return to the role of the rural imaginary in the forging of a modern art tradition in a moment, but the migration of Islamic motifs, quote-unquote Islamic motifs, such as the crescent, into the visual vocabularies of an emerging figurative art tradition points to how features of Islamic art came to be seen as folkloric decoration to be integrated into a figural tradition. So one of the things I argue is that the internalization of the ethos of the Nahda, civilization, progress ethos, imitating European cultural forms, can be traced in the ways many mid-20th century Arab artists emphasized figural painting and retrieved and transformed classical forms into artworks that one could say secularized Islamic motifs. If the European Orientalist tradition insisted that the body of knowledge it created and termed Islamic art, because Islamic art was a largely European invention as a field of study. If they insisted that it was a largely ornamental field of study because Islam prohibited figural painting, this is what they argued, modern Arab and Muslim artists and intellectuals internalized and promoted this misunderstanding of their own past, viewing their heritage through the lens of European Orientalists. Jabra, the Palestinian critic I mentioned before, echoes this narrative of the development of a modern figural art tradition, writing that, quote, in Islam there has been a traditional injunction against the portrayal of the human figure. The injunction was intended to combat the proclivity of early Muslims to worship images instead of God, end quote. The novelist, the great Saudi novelist Abdurrahman Munif, in his commemoration of Salim's Freedom Monument, comments that this figural prohibition partially explains Salim's heavy focus on the pre-Islamic civilizations of the Sumerians, Assyrians, and Babylonians as a source of influence, since locating appropriate figural sources from the Islamic period through which to draw inspiration was less likely. So the pervasiveness of this understanding of the Arab Islamic artistic heritage reveals how the production of a figurative artistic tradition was constituted through the cultural logic of westernization and the framework of the region's artistic history produced by the colonial archive of the Islamic art tradition, which viewed the artistic output of the Arab Islamic world through the civilizational narrative of a practically non-existent visual tradition and an ornamental tradition in decline. In this pervasive civilizational narrative, the modern Arab artists lacked the uninterrupted centuries-long chain of influence that European artists drew from to stage their works as an organic, continuous tradition. The establishment of a modern figural tradition would signal the Arab nations' belated participation in a cosmopolitan international cultural modernity led by European artistic movements. Most painters who saw themselves as pioneers of modern painting in the Middle East were deeply convinced that they came from a surrounding in which not only painting but art in general did not exist. So two important modern artists of the early 20th century adopted this narrative, the Lebanese Mustafa Farroukh and the Egyptian Muhammad Nabi. Farroukh writes of being from a country, quote, devoid of any artistic stimulation, and Nabi despaired about the lack of capacity of the Egyptian peasant to produce art. By the 1940s, as Arab artists returned to their native countries, after studying in Paris, Rome, and London, they searched for the local ingredients with which to construct visual traditions that would harness the past in the making of a modern national art tradition based on figuration. So the move in the 1950s towards excavating vernacular forms from the Islamic and pre-Islamic periods was explicitly linked by Iraqi artists to the rejection of landscape painting. And I'll talk a little bit about the appearance of landscape painting in a moment. But landscape painting was argued to be wedded to an aloof academic European impressionism that, in the context of a non-European setting like colonial Iraq, could only lend itself to mimicry, to a rote mimicry. Thus, the naturalist landscape paintings of Abdul Qadir Rassam, and I'll show you a couple of those, that featured unmistakably, you quote, Iraqi physical structures, such as his portraits of the great mosque of Samarra, had to be transcended and displaced by modernist artists like Salim, if Iraqi art were to disentangle itself from the shadow of European influence and confidently assert itself as Iraqi. The visual vocabularies that emerged from this dilemma of disentangling the national tradition from European naturalism and impressionism were thus products of the colonial encounter, producing aesthetic practices that appear visually to adhere to the expressive dictions of Euro-American modernist abstraction, so here I'm referring to Salim's work, but inhabit a space exterior to its authorized mechanisms of expression and meaning. And here's another image of an impressionist sort of Abdul Qadir Rassam's view of the Tigris River. So that modernism offered these artists a rebellious formal language, right? They could claim their own heritage and use it in the creation of a modern tradition of art, rather than just a landscape portrait or painting which seemed to just mimic what Europeans were doing in Europe, right? So aesthetic modernism was both an international style that, this is what they argued, transcended cultural barriers and one amenable to local modification. Jawad Salim's embrace of modernist visual aesthetics was enabled by modernism's radical formal language, particularly its modified cubism, freeing him to abandon naturalism and impressionism and to search for vernacular forms rooted in civilizational heritage. In this sense, Salim's deployment of Islamic motifs such as the crescent, which, back to the slippages here, the crescent was also argued to be a Sumerian half moon. So there are these ways that the past is resuscitated and very incoherently and talked about in very incoherent ways. But its transition into the rubric of folklore may be interpreted as part of the process of the secularization of the past, whereby folklore functions as a fungible construct through which cultural forms that needed to be marshaled into a national framework would be channeled. Thus, references to folkloric elements of modernist art use the term as a signifier for tradition, heritage, the contemporaneous, local, and the vernacular pre-modern cultural elements that constitute one half of the binary with the modern being figuration. The term folklore carries as well significations of those pre-modern cultural elements that must be made modern through their transfiguration from being affixed to objects of daily use to their presence on a two-dimensional canvas. So this migration from the functional objects, so tapestries, carpets, right, designs on those things, to the canvas entails a shift in perspective and seeing, not simply because the decorative folkloric motif becomes an object to display in galleries, museums, and private collections, but because it marks these objects and motifs as precursors to the next stage of artistic development, characteristic of a mature, two-dimensional modern art tradition. The search for pre-modern cultural forms as the basis of a modern Arab art tradition thus signifies the rerouting of an earlier romantic critique of Western rationalism and positivism into an oppositional aesthetic practice that excavated the material of the past, folklore, and what was described in the Baghdad Group for Modern Art's second manifesto as the Iraqi environment, which posited the necessity of a direct social engagement that included depicting the lives of the people, in Arabic, tasbir hayat al-nas. The merging of these two facets of artistic practice, the decorative and pre-modern forms with the picturing or representation of the people, taswir, fashioned the circulation of images, tropes, and themes that relied heavily on representations of the countryside, the village, and the peasant. It is here where a critique of the rationalism of the Nahda merges with the discourse of primitivism in the development of modern art. Iraqi artists view the rural space and the peasant as a source of cultural and civilizational authenticity, and a repository of timeless culture that, like the folklore or folkloric forms of the past, could be put to use in the making of a modern local culture of visual arts. This iteration of colonial primitivism echoed and re-articulated a discourse of primitivism that was instrumental in the making of the modern traditions in Europe. So think of Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. I don't know if you have an image of that painting, but Picasso's famous for taking what he called primitive forms of Africa and sort of merging them into his two-dimensional cubism. So, if Jawad Salim's paintings of the late 50s have been historicized as marking this successful synthesis of folklore and heritage with the modern European tradition in painting, his visual vocabularies were drawn from the art scene of the 1940s, the Iraqi art scene of the 40s, which was formative in establishing an expansive and experimental culture of painting in Iraq. Jabra Ibrahim Jabra describes the 40s as an age of discovery, wonder, and anticipation, while the Iraqi artist Shakir Hassan al-Sa'id describes the 40s as a period of transition and a point of departure. The modernist Iraqi poet Ghulam al-Haydari considered Jawad Salim and Faik Hassan the two most important figures in the development of modern art in Iraq, constituting its two wings, and it is to Faik Hassan's role that I return to now. Hassan was trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and was only the second Iraqi sent to study to Europe to study art. He returned to Baghdad after graduating in 1938, where he established a department of painting at the Institute of Fine Arts in 1939. In 1940, Hassan formed the first recognizable movement in Iraqi painting and named it the Société Primitive, the Primitive Society. which informally gathered many of Baghdad's aspiring artists, including occasionally Jawad Salim, until 1950 when the group was renamed to the Arabic Ar-Ruwad, the pioneers. The Society Primitive, or just call it the Primitive Society, did not produce a manifesto or a formal agenda, and it did not formally exhibit the paintings produced in its decade of existence until 1950. Jabra chronicled, the Palestinian critic, chronicled the rationale and activities of the group, writing that in the beginning of the 1940s, an informal collection of artists organized excursions to the orchards and forested areas in and around Baghdad to paint the natural world. The location of their first expedition of painting was a forest named King's Forest, a, quote, newly afforested area which had been developed in the 1930s into a greenbelt for Baghdad, end quote. These artists met each Friday, taking with them a flag to mark the territory they painted. The act of marking the territory they visited, land that they committed visually to a two-dimensional canvas, had both an optical and representational function. The two-dimensional representation of the untouched, primitive, and previously unrepresented landscape made it legible, comprehensible, and part of a new constellation and repertoire of images communicated through the consciousness of the urban middle-class subject. The unknown primitive landscape would be made legible through modern systems of visual representation, such as painting, and it would be charted, mapped, and displayed and consumed through the representational strategies of an emerging modern art tradition. The repertoire of images these artists created had implications both for the production and circulation of a new visual culture that represented the emerging national space, and for the consciousness of the middle-class subject, who developed a taste for collecting representations of these unspoiled rural spaces as a contrast to urban life. The artist Mahmoud Sabri wrote in 1959 of the presence of a private art market in Iraq that reflected the particular tastes and habits of bourgeois social classes, including, quote, the intelligentsia, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the educated, the nouveau riche, and the foreign community. So more than simply signaling the emergence of a national pictorial imagination, the representation of primitive landscapes, uncultivated nature, and peasants and villagers engaged in a range of activities established new fields of vision and new visual vocabularies that reinforced the colonial spatial imaginary I mentioned earlier. And it fashioned a romantic popular imagery that consolidated and expanded the distance between the urban middle-class citizen subject of modernity and the primitive rural subject of his or her gaze. We also observe a strange temporal phenomenon in Jabra's observations about the group's first attempts to portray the natural world through the visual representations of forests and orchards around Baghdad. King's Forest, the first natural primitive space the artists sought to depict in their paintings, was in fact not a pristine, untouched landscape, but a newly afforested greenbelt formed as part of the city's urban expansion, a space cultivated by the very process, man-made urbanization, they sought to escape. On the one hand, their search for an untouched natural landscape initially led them to a modern, recently cultivated man-made forest. On the other, their unsuccessful search for a pristine landscape in a nation that was at the time primarily rural suggests that the urban perspective and consciousness had become the dominant mode of seeing and experiencing modernity for the expanding Baghdadi middle class, whose vision of the nation's spaces and landscapes was articulated aesthetically through the gaze of the bourgeois artist. Critically, their search for primitive landscapes and eventually peasants to depict was motivated by a similar motivation as the primitivism of European artists, an alternative to the colonial materialism and rationalism of Western modernity. The energetic commitment of Iraqi artists to, just shift to another image here, I'll get to this image in a moment, but the energetic commitment of Iraqi artists to primitive landscape painting evokes, of course, the long tradition of European landscape painting that preceded and influenced them. W.J.T. Mitchell, in his renowned theses on landscape painting, writes that, quote, landscape is a medium of exchange between the human and the natural, the self and the other, end quote. Mitchell asks whether it is possible that landscape, understood as a historical invention of a new visual pictorial medium, is connected with imperialism. He writes, quote, at a minimum we need to explore the possibility that the representation of landscape is not only a matter of internal politics and national or class ideology, but also an international global phenomenon intimately bound up with the discourse of imperialism, end quote. Yet Mitchell treads cautiously, noting that even as landscape painting in China emerged at the height of Chinese imperial power, its first iteration on the European continent in the Netherlands was both an anti-imperial and nationalistic cultural gesture. The transformation of the Netherlands from a rebellious colony into a maritime empire in the second half of the 17th century indicates at the very least how quickly and drastically the political environment of agricultural practice can change, and it suggests the possibility of hybrid landscape formations that might be characterized simultaneously as imperial and anti-colonial. Naturally, landscape painting by Europeans in the colony communicated a different set of visual vocabularies and representational strategies than those within European spaces. As David Bunn has written, the conventional association in landscape painting between landscape and vision is complicated on the colonial frontier because of the association between sight and surveillance. The colonial landscape, he writes, is conceived as a liminal zone between the self and savagery, and rendering things visible is a necessary prerequisite to administrative control. End quote. Visual representation of the primitive spaces of nature in the colonial space had markedly different implications than the representations in European spaces. Beyond the obvious connotations of racial and cultural otherness that accompany visual representation of the colonial primitive, they also symbolize the penetration and claiming of uncharted territory. So landscape painting can sort of claim visually lands that European colonial powers were colonizing. These colonial landscape conventions were not the same in every colonial space. While the lands of China, India, the Middle East had ancient, urbanized, and imperial civilizations of their own that conditioned how Europeans depicted them visually, places like New Zealand and the South Pacific were seen as the last refuges of prehistoric, pre-civilized people in a state of nature. Such spaces provided Europeans with a kind of tabula rasa for the fantasies of European imperialism, a place where European landscape conventions could work themselves out virtually unimpeded by native resistance. The pictorial representation of these colonial spaces were assimilated into the formal conventions and vocabularies of European landscape painting, bringing the unruly and unrecognizable landscape of the colony into codified and recognizable vocabularies of representation. Similarly, the conventions of landscape painting adopted by Iraqi artists, which largely replicated European stylistic formal qualities, raise a series of questions about its mobility to the space of the colony, where bourgeois native artists took up the conventions of the genre and applied it to the landscapes of what they viewed as their own primitive topography.